So today it can really feel like Christmas is everywhere this time of year, but it really wasn't always that way, especially in colonial New England. King's Chapel is one of, if not the first church in New England to celebrate Christmas when it was founded over 300 years ago. But much to the dismay of its colonial Puritan neighbors in Boston, King's Chapel has, like I said, been decking the halls and forging Christmas traditions all the way since 1686. But why was this the case, and why was Christmas so controversial in 18th century New England? So in today's program, we'll be exploring some of the rich history and holiday traditions of Christmas at King's Chapel, from how Christmas was celebrated both at the church itself and by members at home throughout the church's history, as well as the church's connections to the evolution of holiday traditions as we know them today. So we'll start way back in the 1600s and work our way into the 19th century. And so we'll start again by looking at the question of why Christmas was not celebrated widely in colonial New England, and why was King's Chapel one of the first churches here to observe the holiday. So King's Chapel was founded in Boston in 1686. The church's Christmas celebrations were not embraced by the city's religious majority of Puritans. This comes as a surprise to a lot of people, and in some ways it seems like a silly law, but over 350 years ago, Christmas was actually outlawed in Massachusetts. From 1659 until 1681, there was a law saying, quote, whoever shall be found observing such days as Christmas or the like, either by forbearing labor, feasting, or any other way upon any such account as aforesaid, every such person offending shall pay for every such offense 5 shillings as a fine to the country. There isn't really any known enforcement of this law, but it was nonetheless on the books, if you will. The main reason for this has to do with the religious and cultural differences between the Puritans, the religious sect that established Boston as an English city in the 1620s, and the Church of England, the faith originally worshipped here at King's Chapel. So here in Boston, Puritans who founded the city had several reasons to object to Christmas celebrations. The main reason was simply that there's no biblical basis for celebrating the birth of Jesus in December. On your screen here, you'll see some pages from the version of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer that was used by King's Chapel during really the extent of its Anglican era, so from the 1680s through the 1780s. And you'll see on the calendar there that, of course, Christmas is listed in December, as well as the beginning of the Christmas Day service. But the timing of Christmas to be celebrated as a Christian holiday in December was chosen by the Roman Catholic Church to coincide with pre-existing pagan winter solstice festivals, really as a way to encourage people they were attempting to convert to Christianity to observe the holiday by aligning a new feast day along with celebrations that were already taking place. The Puritan opposition to what they perceived as excesses and corruption within Roman Catholicism, as well as within the Church of England, who observed Christmas, really added to their disapproval of the holiday. And secondly, Boston Puritans objected to the ways in which the English and other European countries celebrated Christmas outside the church in more secular and cultural ways. There is a famous Puritan anti-Christmas sermon preached by Cotton Mather in Boston in 1712, which I've excerpted part of here, which really lays it all out, explaining the many reasons why Christmas was so objected to in colonial Boston. So we'll read a little bit of that now. Quote, "'Tis an evident affront unto the grace of God for men to make the birth of our Holy Savior an encouragement and an occasion for the very unholy enormities. Can you in your conscience think that our Holy Savior is honored by mad mirth, by long eating, by hard drinking, by lewd gaming, by rude reveling, by mass fit for none but a Saturn or a Bacchus, or the night of Mahadan Ramadan? Shall it be said that the birth of our Savior, for which we owe as high praises to God as the heavenly host can do, we can take the time to please the hellish legions and to do actions that have more to do that more have much more hell than heaven in them. Christmas time was seen as what has been as a time for what's been dubbed misrule, debauchery, antics, and rowdiness. For one, the season was culturally associated through much of Europe with excessive feasting and drinking. Christmas being scheduled to happen in December, lined up with many regions' annual livestock slaughtering in preparation for the colder months, as well as a time of year when beer and wine from crops grown in milder months were fermented and ready for drinking. So it was associated with a kind of time of feasting as well. English Christmas time traditions incorporated this sort of rowdiness and debauchery, which Puritans found offensive, to correlate with a holiday intended to celebrate Jesus's birth. Popular English traditions of the Puritan era, so coinciding with that era, early 1700s, included activities such as mumming and wassailing, which one way to look at these is sort of like rowdy Christmas trick-or-treating mixed with Christmas caroling. Mumming traditions included dressing up in costumes ranging from animals to cross-dressing, and folks would rove from homes of the wealthy, including employers and their landlords, singing bawdy songs, performing skits, demanding food, drink, and money. This was practiced to some extent amongst kind of maritime communities and working class in port cities in New England, and it was really not approved of by much of the kind of Puritan establishment. And these activities also took place in Boston. There's records of it in the 1760s and onwards. I'll also mention this PBS special, Lucy Worsley's 12 Days of Tudor Christmas. I highly recommend it if you're interested in learning more about the roots of these kind of English Christmas time traditions and misrule. It's usually plays on PBS around this time of year, and it really kind of brings these traditions to light in a way that explains it pretty well. But another tradition that associated with Christmas that the Puritans disapproved of was decorating with greenery, which is kind of one of the most common traditions that many of us associate with Christmas today. And of course, here are some photographs of King's Chapel in modern day, dressed with greens for the holiday season. But greenery was a tradition appropriated for the season, again, from pagan solstice traditions. And Puritans, again, saw this as offensive to associate with the birth of Jesus. But members of the Anglican Church or Church of England, of course, didn't share these same objections. And churches like King's Chapel would have held Christmas services, and their members celebrated in secular ways as well. King's Chapel's first Christmas service took place in 1686 in the townhouse, which is essentially the seat of colonial government in Boston. So moving to this next section, talk a little bit about what Christmas looked like in colonial King's Chapel and within Boston as a whole. Just a brief description of King's Chapel's first Christmas services provided in the journals of Judge Samuel Sewall, who's well known as a kind of prolific diarist of the colonial era. And his journals included kind of yearly reflections, or not necessarily reflections, but comments on what Christmas looked like each year. And although he was a Puritan, he did kind of mention Christmas, but most likely or most commonly to kind of express his discontent with what was happening. Of the first Christmas celebration at King's Chapel, he wrote, quote, Governor Edmund Andros goes to the townhouse for service forenoon and afternoon, a red coat going on his right hand and Captain George on his left. Was not at lecture on Thursday. Shops open today generally, and persons are about their occasions, some but few carts at town with wood, though the day exceeding fair and pleasant. So like I said, in addition to kind of commenting on the Christmas services being held by King's Chapel, he's of course also sharing, that business is really taking place as usual throughout Boston on Christmas Day. The previous year, so right before King's Chapel came to Boston in 1685, he had also commented on Christmas. And although at that point there wasn't an established church observing the holiday, some Bostonians, perhaps including some of the Anglicans who would form King's Chapel's early congregation the next year, as well as French Huguenots, observed Christmas independently. So his 1685 reflection reads, quote, "Carts come to town and shops open as is usual. Some somehow observe the day, but are vexed, I believe, that the body of the people profane it. And blessed be God, no authority yet to compel them to keep it." But unfortunately, of course, that authority would come the next year. The oldest King's Chapel Christmas tradition is, as I mentioned a little earlier, greening the church, which simply means decorating with evergreens like spruce, pine, fir, and more. As I mentioned, this is one of the oldest Christmas traditions predating Christianity. And of course, it's something still upheld by many folks celebrating Christmas today. Based on financial records from the church, we also know that King's Chapel was indeed decorating the church with greens from as early as the 1690s, if not earlier, although the church had its first established building completed in 1688. So we're not sure if they were sprucing up the townhouse or other areas where they were worshiping before then. We also know that King's Chapel was possibly a target for vandalism during the Christmas season at the time when the majority of churches and people in Boston weren't celebrating the holiday. Year after year, financial records and bills show bills and receipts for repairing broken windows around Christmas time. So throughout December and early January, there's kind of a unnatural amounts of broken windows happening year after year. But King's Chapel continued to decorate for Christmas and to kind of pursue their traditions and early celebrations. Also in the 1690s, we know that by this point, the church is taking special collections in December to distribute to the poor at Christmas time. One example for this that we find in the records of the church warden's in vestry from 1695 reads, "Ordered the disposal thus to the minister to the poor at Christmas to buy Bibles with common prayers and singing psalms to the poorer sort of the church." Outside of the church, members may have also decorated their homes with greens, and we do know that churchgoers were feasting similarly to how a lot of people celebrate holidays today, like Thanksgiving and Christmas, by hosting family and friends for an elaborate meal, playing games, etc. And despite the majority, again, of Bostonians not observing Christmas, King's Chapel's members, like I said, continue to pursue these traditions and celebrations. Judge Sewell continued to record his observations on King's Chapel kind of versus the rest of Boston each December 25th. In 1703, for instance, he wrote, "The Christmas keepers had a very pleasant day, Governor and Mr. Dudley at church, and Mr. Dudley made a pretty large entertainment after." So referencing these celebrations and feasts outside of the church as well. While in most years, including 1705, on the right side of your screen, he made sure to note that, again, business as usual on Christmas. Tuesday, December 25th, very cold day, but serene morning, sleds, sleighs, and horses pass as usually, and shops open. Of course, in the years following, I mentioned earlier, the 1712 Cotton Mather anti-Christmas sermon. Tensions did continue to pop up between Puritans and Anglicans of King's Chapel around Christmas time, including in 1714, when Puritans complained that because Christmas fell on a Saturday, King's Chapel didn't observe their regular Sunday services and allegedly were disruptive to the Puritan services while they were going about their daily work. As well as a bit later in 1722, when the governor urged the general courts to adjourn over the Christmas holiday, which is kind of more commonplace idea today to close businesses or to close the courts, but many Puritans involved in local governments were not in agreement with this decision. Additionally, when King's Chapel was under construction in the 1750s during the building of our current building, which still exists today, the church had borrowed a Puritan or congregational meeting house for their Christmas service, but had to agree that they wouldn't put up any greenery while they were celebrating. So in the 1750s, King's Chapel celebrated Christmas right down the street at the Old South Meeting House. But you can see in this vote here that, quote, to the above letter we received on the 14th, the verbal answer that our request was granted, so they were able to hold our Christmas services there. And their church was at our service for the time desired, only they expected that we would not decorate it with spruce. So again, making some kind of compromises there on the Puritan side for lending their building for an Anglican Christmas service. A really neat description that I found of Christmas at King's Chapel in the 1700s comes from this man, Manasseh Cutler, in 1765. Cutler would later become a congregational clergyman, as well as a congressman, and also kind of a frontiersman and founder of some institutions in Ohio later on in life. But in 1765, he was in his early 20s and living in Dedham, Massachusetts, when he celebrated Christmas in Boston at King's Chapel and wrote about his experience in his diary. He likely remembered this Christmas 3 years later, since this Christmas Eve was when he met his future wife, when the two took a carriage ride to Boston and listened to bells at the Old North Church. But on December 25th, he wrote, quote, Wednesday, Christmas, went to church at King's Chapel, where was a very gay and brilliant assembly. Several intervals in reading service made for singing anthems, which were performed extremely well. Service was read by Parson Caner, and a sermon preached, or rather a harangue pronounced by Parson Troutbeck. After the service, a collection was made for the poor, then the sacrament was administered, which I did not tarry to see. Dined at Mr. Williams, a very handsome dinner. In the afternoon, service was read, an anthem sung, but no sermon. The church is built of stone, very beautifully adorned with carved pillars, several images, etc. Here is a very good set of organs, but not bells, as a steeple is not erected. The following day, he joined in another holiday feast on the 26th and went for a sleigh ride and ended up summing up his kind of Christmas experience as, quote, so much for Christmas. We unfortunately don't have any images from the 1700s of how King's Chapel was decorated for the holidays, but we do have plenty of references for the 19th century. So I'll just show this image, but we'll talk a little bit more about it a bit later on. The earliest depictions of Christmas decorations at King's Chapel is this image from 1856, which is published in an illustrated newspaper. And Christmas celebrations in New England in the mid-19th century are beginning to become a bit more widespread. And you can really see how elaborate King's Chapel was decorated by that point. But among the decorations and expenses associated with Christmas, kind of in the late 1700s, include annual payments to a Thomas Clement for, quote, erecting arches for Christmas. He's paid for that every year in the 1790s. And they're also paying for printed reproductions of various Christmas hymns during this period. So again, there's some kind of evidence, again, that music is playing an important role in Christmas services at King's Chapel, and perhaps these erected arches from the 1790s may have resembled something that we see later on. Like I said, music took on an important role and continues to play an important role in Christmas services at King's Chapel. The kind of Christmas music as we know it today didn't exist in kind of that sense in the 1700s, but it is the century where we see kind of the emergence of Christian hymnals that are including Christmas themed music. This included an Anglican hymnal called New Versions of the Psalms by Nicholas Brady and Nahum Tate, or the Tate and Brady hymnal, which included one of the first Christmas songs called While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night. It was first printed in Boston in 1713, and we know that King's Chapel had a copy from that first printing, so it's possible that some of this music may have been incorporated in those services. Interestingly, another popular hymnal that included Christmas songs was written by a Congregationalist named Isaac Watts. The frequency of printing picked up in New England between the 1760s and 1780s of this particular volume. And there are Christmas historians that have estimated that by 1780, about half of the New England Christian churches had a copy of Watts's text. So of course, we know that King's Chapel had access to this Christmas music since 1713. And we know from 1765, when Cutler visited, that there was a lot of music incorporated in the services. But it wasn't until 1865 that King's Chapel had a full musical Christmas service, or kind of a carol type service. And it, like I said, Christmas music is very important to Christmas services today. But when and why did Christmas celebrations and traditions begin to become more widespread in New England? There's really a lot of reasons for this, but kind of a short answer is gradually throughout the 19th century is when this starts to take place. Over time, what's been dubbed by folks like Stephen Nissenbaum and others who write a lot about Christmas history as the Puritan War on Christmas began to ease in Christmas services, and traditions began to become more widespread. Religious demographics began to shift a bit more throughout the early 19th century in the region, though, as I said, Christmas still wouldn't be super widely celebrated until later on. But during this era, New England Puritanism has been given way to Congregationalism. There's growing numbers of Episcopalians and Roman Catholics in the region, and Unitarianism is growing in the Boston area and New England as well. So following the American Revolution, King's Chapel emerged as the first Unitarian church in the United States. And through keeping their traditional Anglican style liturgy during that transition, King's Chapel maintained its Christmas traditions, even though it had moved to a new theology, which would ultimately provide some kind of interesting links to other Christmas traditions in the Boston area. So as we move into the 19th century, as I said, more New Englanders are beginning to celebrate Christmas kind of by the mid-century in their churches and homes, and we see the spread of some decorating traditions, which are pretty widespread today, namely the Christmas tree, which on the left of your screen, we see a very popular 19th century illustration of Prince Albert and Queen Victoria's Christmas tree, which has been credited with helping spread the popularity of the Christmas tree throughout the United States during the Victorian era. But on the right, we have the Christmas tree set up in the King's Chapel Parish House, which is a fun tradition that we have every year. But one of the kind of main influences over this tradition in the early to mid 1800s, including the contributions of German immigrants, and again, the influence of the Victorian era. German immigrants to the United States were really responsible for bringing the Christmas tree to this country, including the first Christmas tree in New England, which was introduced by a man named Charles Fallon. Charles Fallon was a German immigrant who became a Harvard professor, as well as a notable Unitarian minister. So again, not a minister at King's Chapel, but of the same faith and denomination practiced at King's Chapel during this era. Charles Fallon was also a very strong abolitionist and was colleagues with other notable Unitarian ministers, including very close friends with William Ellery Channing. Having grown up in Germany, where the tradition of Christmas trees originated, he wanted to kind of introduce that favorite childhood tradition to his own children. And in 1832, he set up what is thought to be the first Christmas tree in New England in his home. And folks were really interested in this and visited his home to see the Christmas tree. There's some kind of cool reflections that share what that Christmas tree looked like. So the image on the right is a 19th century era illustration of kind of a tabletop Christmas tree. And Charles Fallon's Christmas tree in the 1830s was described kind of in a similar style. Quote, "The tree was set in a tub and its branches hung with small dolls, gilded eggshells and paper cornucopias filled with candied fruits. The tree was illuminated with numerous candles. It really looked beautiful. The room seemed in a blaze and the ornaments were hung so well on that no accident happened except that one doll's petticoat caught fire. There was a sponge tied to the end of a stick to put out any supernumerary blaze and no harm ensued. I mounted the steps behind the tree to see the effect of opening the doors. It was delightful. The children poured in, but in a moment every voice was hushed. Their faces were upturned to the blaze, all eyes wide open and lips parted, all steps arrested." Excuse me. Although Charles Fallon ultimately died in a tragic fire unrelated to his Christmas tree, should mention. Prior to the abolition of slavery, as I mentioned, he was a very strong abolitionist. The Civil War era would introduce another notable Christmas tradition to the United States, which is the modern image of Santa Claus, which I'll just briefly mention. Notable political cartoonist Thomas Nast introduced the modern Santa Claus image in Harper's Weekly through a series of pro-union illustrations in the 1860s, and I've just included those on the screen here as an interesting side note. What did these 19th century decorations look like at King's Chapel? And when was there kind of a shift to more secular and commercial Christmas displays? And there is kind of an interesting connection to King's Chapel there as well. By the 1860s and 1870s, as I mentioned earlier, Christmas is becoming a bit more widespread during this century in New England, and in Boston, local newspapers began printing detailed descriptions of how churches in the area are decorating for Christmas, and King's Chapel is consistently at the top of the pack. In many ways, this is sort of a precursor to the elaborate public Christmas displays we see today throughout the United States, from municipal light displays and public Christmas tree lightings to also the window displays at department stores. It's kind of an interesting way to think about that. As I mentioned earlier, this is an image from 1856, is the first known depiction of Christmas decorations at King's Chapel. When I first saw it, I remember thinking, this is insane and beautiful, and there's no way this illustration is accurate. But when you start to get into the financial records for how much King's Chapel is spending on Christmas decorations and the amount of different types of greenery, as well as the descriptions you'll see in the later decades in newspapers, I'd say this is probably a pretty accurate depiction, which is pretty neat, I think. But here's one example of the descriptions we see in the newspapers of the Christmas displays at the churches. This is from the Boston Daily Globe from Christmas Day in 1874. The Christmas decorations here at King's Chapel will be somewhat more elaborate than last year, and the style of the interior affords the best opportunity for a prime display. Nothing but evergreen and hemlocks is used, and these massed upon the capitals of the columns and pilasters produce an excellent effect. There but little to be said in detail of the decorations further than that bands of green surmount the windows and doors, being placed wherever the general effect can be heightened. Luckily as well, well, it's an illustration first, but we do have at least one photograph of 19th century Christmas decorations at the church. But first, this is I believe it's a watercolor, which is housed in the lobby of the King's Chapel Parish House, which was painted in 1880, depicting the church decorated for Christmas time. So a bit less elaborate than what we saw in the 1850s, but it gives you kind of a glimpse of what that looked like, as well as kind of the rich warmth of the color scheme of the church prior to the early 20th century, when the church was whitewashed. And you can see the 1860s stained glass windows in there as well. So this really kind of rich, vibrant warmth of the color during the Christmas era in the 1880s. But this is at this time, our one known actual photograph of Christmas decorations in 19th century King's Chapel. And it's taken from the front of the church, right next to the pulpit. So you can't see kind of the whole church from here, but from what we can see here, you can tell that it is pretty elaborate and ornate. You know, the sounding board above the pulpit, you can see the tops of the capitals, much like in those earlier illustrations, are also kind of filled with greenery. All of the altar pieces and the chancel windows as well, and you can see glimpses of the gallery railings decorated here as well. But as I mentioned, of course, there is a shift away from newspapers describing Christmas decorations within churches to more secular and commercial displays. Christmas lights, as kind of we know them today, were introduced in the early 1880s. And this coincides with an era of the rise of department stores, who very quickly took on the tradition of decorating for the holidays as well. One of these early department stores in Boston was called Houghton and Dutton, and it was actually located literally directly across the street from King's Chapel. So these are two photographs. I've circled the department store, but in each one you can see King's Chapel. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the photo on the left is taken from School Street, kind of looking up behind the church, and you can see at the location, for those familiar with the area, this is where 1 Beacon Street stands today, but this is a department store, Houghton and Dutton. And then this photograph on the right is looking down Tremont Street towards the Boston Common from right outside the King's Chapel burying ground. And you can see the chapel on the left side of the street and the department store on the right. So as we move from the 1870s to 1880s, what began with Christmas articles describing the decorations in the churches starts to shift to describing the decorations in department stores. But what's interesting is that these early descriptions of the holiday displays at Houghton and Dutton often juxtapose the historic church with the modern department store across the street. These are two photographs from the early 20th century showing the Christmas displays on the corner of Tremont and Beacon Street. So this is the corner literally directly across the street from King's Chapel, which you can see in this photograph on the left. These early newspaper articles talk about the Christmas lights casting their reflection and projecting this like warm Christmas glow on King's Chapel. And it's a really interesting visual to kind of imagine what the church would have looked like lit up by these early Christmas lights across the way. Here, of course, we see the department stores incorporating Santa Claus. It's interesting too to see these reminiscences of kind of the early politicized Santa Claus, if you will, that we saw in the 1860s. They're very patriotic displays with American flags and sayings of prosperity, preparedness, and peace, and stars. It's kind of interesting to look at that as well. And by the time we get to the 20th century, when these Christmas light displays are taking place, and there's kind of this shift away from the descriptions of the Christmas decorations in the churches, we've really established the roots of many of the known Christmas traditions, past and present, that continue on today. And I hope this provided kind of an interesting look into kind of the history and evolution of Christmas celebrations, decorations, and traditions in New England through the lens of King's Chapel and its place as a historic church and one of the first to celebrate Christmas. And before we move into the questions, I'll just say, wishing you all happy holidays. We're quickly approaching the holiday season. This is me and my rabbit, Milo, posing for a Christmas card. So I just want to share that. But I'll let you know that we are sharing additional history content and online activities you can participate in from home related to Christmas history in King's Chapel every Friday. And we also have information for the upcoming Christmas, Advent and Christmas services at King's Chapel here. And we'll be posting links to all of this through our Christmas history activities, as well as information on the upcoming